What makes a great D&D game?
The sun is a wondrous body, like a magnificent father. If only I could be so grossly incandescent.
Is it the world building, the encounter balance, or the homebrew? Or is it something deeper? In my experience, although all of those things can contribute to a good game, great games are a result of a strong table culture. Your table's culture is a set of values and beliefs that, when respected, cultivates deeper and deeper trust. While I do think that things like world building and encounter balance have their place in great game design, I think that they're best executed when informed by a table's culture, not created in advance of it. Hi, I'm John from Incendium D&D, and today we're discussing our model for cultivating trust at your table. What makes TTRPGs a unique gaming medium is that all of the action is delivered and processed through a human rather than a program. While video games express their designer's vision through graphics and player inputs, they're still ultimately limited by their programming. Even the most well-polished open-world games still have a limited number of choices that a player can make. And as such, only so many storytelling possibilities that they can generate. TTRPGs have no such limitations. A game master is at liberty to make judgment calls, bending or breaking rules of the system in order to accommodate specific situations. They are free to make calls to what's best going to serve their table. They can rewrite the program on the fly, so to speak. But of course, this also presents unique challenges. Because the game's processor is human, the system has greater imaginative potential, but is also more vulnerable. Humans are fallible. We forget rules, make dumb calls, end up in stupid arguments that can harm real-world relationships. So when talking about delivering a quality TTRPG experience, we have to start by addressing that human element. So how do we go about doing this? How can we create a human practice that allows us to diagnose and address vulnerabilities in our system so that we can deliver the best that TTRPGs have to offer? Our answer is R.E.S.T, an acronym for respect, empathy, satisfaction, and trust. When working through this progression, a game master or player is investing in a positive culture at the table, which ends up paying dividends when factoring the earlier things like homebrew or world building. In my experience, starting from the opposite place does not work. For example, let's look at one of my favorite D&D settings, Eberron, a technological world of noir intrigue with morally gray storytelling conflicts. Eberron has awesome artwork, story hooks, unique gameplay mechanics. You can ride a lightning rail from the far corners of Corvair and scheme in the different royal courts. It's an evocative setting with a unique attitude, one that me and lots of other fellow game masters get really excited to run. But the player's enjoyment of the game that's going to be run is going to be limited by the culture at the table. If the dungeon master or the players are being disrespectful, maybe disrupting each other or constantly texting, no matter how good the world building and encounter balance is, I don't think that game is going to be very fun to play. Now, for the sake of argument, let's actually assess the opposite. Both the dungeon master and the players are really respectful and kind to each other, and they stay engaged with the game that they're playing. Yeah, there might not be a lot of deep world building or intricate lore, but I guarantee even with those things, the players are going to enjoy themselves more because the energy at the table is a lot more positive. In fact, maybe the DM is new and just bad at encounter balance. You go through a lot of fights that are way too easy, and then all of a sudden there's a fight that's way too hard. If that DM is respectful and willing to admit when they messed up, it's gonna be easier for the whole table to find a solution that's okay with everybody. You get the idea. Ultimately, to begin with the end in mind, I think this all comes down to trust. Without trust, the best world building or the most precise encounter balance isn't going to land well with your players. With trust, though, TTRPGs have the potential to be life-changing and become so important to all participants involved that people will be willing to move their entire schedules around to accommodate it. Well, maybe, but trust isn't something that's cultivated overnight. It takes time to build trust at your table, and it might take longer with some individuals based on their past gaming or real-world experiences. So, how do we go about doing that? Building trust all comes back to respect. That golden little rule we all learned in kindergarten. Although, one of my martial arts mentors had this great little addition I'd like to share with all of you. Treat other people the way you would like to be treated if you were them. To me, when focusing on the respect pillar of R.E.S.T, your focus is on kindness and boundaries. Most people will understand the value of learning to be patient with your players, whether they're new or veterans, and to avoid being snarky or condescending or just mean with your tone. Now, what I mean by boundaries is that you want to define and hold onto the agreements that you make at your table. And a lot of people will have these unspoken agreements, and the longer and longer I play, the more value I find in actually saying a lot of these things out loud. For example, there are a lot of ugly, real-world topics I don't want involved in the storytelling at my TTRPG tables. And really that ends up being anything over like a PG-13 in terms of content. In fact, one of the things I say out loud at session zeros, especially if I'm introducing a new player that hasn't gotten used to the culture at my particular table, are lines and veils. Lines are hard boundaries the table agrees they won't cross. This is especially important if you have had players with real-world experiences that they're working through. Veils, on the other hand, are for content that we can acknowledge or hint at. But everyone needs to agree that when this certain topic is brought up, we have to tread carefully. An example about how these two kinds of boundaries can interact is in-game romance. For some tables, romance is a line. They don't want any of that mushy, feely crap. The table, or even individual players, may be uncomfortable with player characters getting romantically involved as part of the story. Or perhaps romance is a veil. An example being that we can maybe hint at player characters dating, but not like go into weird detail about it. Or perhaps it's a combination of lines and veils. For example, it's cool to explore the romantic storyline of a PC and an NPC, but it gets kind of weird if two PCs start dating each other in-game. And I'm sure you can already see how problematic it would be for a table's culture and cultivating trust if, say, romance is considered like a line, but some players start making off-color jokes about PCs and NPCs and the like. I am speaking as someone who has definitely made a lot of mistakes and watched how it negatively affects the culture of a table. And these concepts don't only have to apply to groups. For example, Travis Willingham from Critical Role. Again, if you've watched this channel for long enough, you know I'm not a big CR livestream fan, but from my understanding, his character becoming romantically involved used to be a line. It was something that he was uncomfortable with for his character, but he was plenty supportive of the other players around the table, exploring whatever plot lines they wanted to. And eventually, that line shifted to a veil, and eventually that veil was no longer needed. There was enough trust cultivated at the table that now romance is something that he's willing to explore. But the key thing there was the table's culture matured, and it was his decision to recognize that a line became a veil and then that veil was no longer needed. It wasn't something where his dungeon master said, "I think it would be interesting for your character," because Matt Mercer doesn't talk like that, first of all. Now, you also want to be sensitive to the other side of the spectrum, where there may be certain things that you or the players didn't expect to be lines or veils, but you discover them accidentally through gameplay. An example I have of this is a fellow DM was telling me how when they were describing a particular creature, they were going into all this explicit detail, and all of a sudden, a player got really uncomfortable with it and later let them know that they actually didn't realize how uncomfortable they'd get from this really visceral description. So the monster type didn't need to be like removed from the game, but they did need a veil to be drawn. In that maybe you just don't go as descriptive with the creature. We just kind of know it's a bad thing and we're going to fight it. This can be counterintuitive for a lot of dungeon masters because they want to create an immersive experience, and really the best way they know how is to be as descriptive as possible. But it's a great example of how respecting the feelings of a player over your perceptions of what makes a great game can actually invest more trust at the table. And as that table culture matures, now that player may get comfortable again. Even Matt Mercer of Critical Role has said, as good friends as everyone around the table is, as much as they use safety tools like lines and veils, you never know if someone is in a particular funk in a day, or that you're about to bring up content that no one even could predict would make someone feel uncomfortable. So how you respond to someone needing a line or veil is just as, if not more powerful, than agreeing upon it in the first place, although you can prevent a lot of unpleasantness by making vocalized agreements at the outset. One last thing on this topic. In general, in terms of content, I would follow the age recommendation of the particular system you're running. If your particular table is comfortable exploring more mature content, then I would just be incredibly transparent about what content you're all okay with including. D&D is rated ages 12 and up, so PG-13 level of violence, you know, like Lord of the Rings or Marvel, anything like that is probably going to be okay. However, too much gore or adult situations, what? I would probably tend to avoid. Again, unless you're very transparent about what kind of content everyone is okay with appearing. And make sure to be extra sensitive. It's always better to lower explicit content than it is to try to ramp it up over time. That being said, if you play something like Vampire the Masquerade, the recommended age is 18 plus. Signing up for that system means you're signing up for heavier content. So if your game master includes R-rated content in Vampire, well, you bought your ticket to the show. Now, I've played in a lot of games where, say, a dungeon master is perfectly respectful, they have clear boundaries, and are respectful with their tone, but don't necessarily demonstrate a lot of empathy. Perhaps they ran a dungeon crawl and included content that we all agreed on and adjudicated the action precisely as the system dictates. But just because they did all that doesn't mean they struck an emotional chord with the players. That's what empathy is all about. Most people in my circle that really get into TTRPGs do so because it feels like their contributions matter. You can usually tell the skill of a given game master by where they're adjudicating from. If they're ruling from a place like, well, this is how it works in my world, or these are the rules of the system I chose to use, chances are that they can be playing respectfully, but not necessarily empathetically. Instead, a good linguistic cue that they're ruling from an empathetic place is using the term we instead of I. We'll come to a solution. We'll see where this goes. Now, this doesn't mean you have to let your players live all the time or save them from dying. In fact, an empathetic dungeon master might say something like, I know that this hurts right now, but by respecting the tone of the world, everybody is gonna have more fun, feeling like these consequences matter, which adds to the game's excitement for everyone. It's a very different place than, I like it when there's more risk involved. And then you can see how well your call matched up with the culture of your table. I actually just had this debate with one of my players who had very valid criticism of, you know, when I play in one of your games, it feels like you're saving all of the player characters all the time. The story feels like there's little risk. And my response was, a lot of my players are really invested in their characters' stories right now. They would be devastated if their character died, especially in a mundane or anticlimactic way, because it would mean that their story is over. That devastation isn't worth honoring death per the mechanics of the game in a traditional way. Yeah, there's definitely been times I've BS'd some reason why a player got to live and they really shouldn't have been able to. When that does happen, I usually have it cost something. So for example, maybe there's a permanent injury they suffer, or maybe they live because a treasured NPC jumps in the way at the last second and takes the fatal blow for them, which adds to their character's internal drama. Yeah, the PC lived, but at what cost? In summary so far, practicing respect means establishing boundaries that you adhere to. Empathy is understanding the feelings and gameplay desires of your players and adjudicating in a way that accentuates and highlights those things. If you combine those two, chances are you'll have a real recipe for success. Now, I don't want to put world building and encounter balance to the side as if they don't matter at all to a great game. In fact, this next section, satisfaction, is when those things start to pop in. I will stick by with what I said earlier. A game that's adjudicated with respect and empathy, but without good encounter balance or world building, is going to be a lot more enjoyable to play than the reverse. But why do we have to pick? You see, when you run a game with respect and empathy, trust is going to cultivate itself naturally. That's when you can play with things like deep world building, encounter balance, and homebrew. But rather than say, I have a cool world, would you guys like to play in it? If you spend some time getting to know your players, learn what excites them, you can now design custom rules and a homebrew world that's going to highlight those things. What is it they like about social interaction, exploration, combat? Do they find extensive lore drops boring? Do they like combat that tests their smarts? Or do they like combat that's simpler and faster? You can even add these little rules adjustments over time to tune your game to your players' maximum enjoyment. The more you cultivate trust at your table through respect and empathy, and then amplify that with custom tuning to your game, the more and more enjoyable your sessions are destined to become. All in all, the ultimate one is trust. What's hard about discussing trust is that it's not a measurable thing. I mean, a lot of these concepts aren't. Although with something like respect, setting good boundaries, you can say have like a player contract that everyone can reference to. With satisfaction, if you play with a lot of homebrew rules, you can have a record of what's worked and what hasn't. But with trust, that's a feeling. But with it, the game goes from feeling fun to feeling magical, which is kind of cheesy, but
Grommet, that's it, cheese.
An example I want to speak to from experience is running the boss encounter that the players are not going to win. This is a trope you might have seen in video games. The party is thrown at a boss that is like way above their level. As part of the story, the players are crushed, but then saved by plot contrivances. Now, in the TTRPG sense, this used to annoy the crap out of me as a player. To me, part of the magic of TTRPGs was that the random dice rolls could end up in your favor, and even an impossible boss could be defeated by good enough tactics. If it felt like we were designed to lose, it was a direct hit on our player agency. And I knew a lot of my players felt the same way. At a table that hadn't spent time cultivating trust, pulling such a narrative maneuver may have led to a lot of weird feelings. Well, in my latest campaign, that's exactly what I did. For the first 9 sessions, I built up this mysterious bad guy working in the shadows. Then, at the end of session 10, right before my players were about to really easily decimate his lieutenant, my big bad guy showed up. The first character goes to attack, gets 2 critical hits, and my character has adamantine armor. He then uses heat metal on the primary weapons of the different martial characters. Now disarmed, he goes to town. One by one, the characters start to drop. The party doesn't know what to do. Then by narrative contrivance, they get saved. Some players even said it felt like it impeded their player agency. However, whereas in the past, these players may have held on to a feeling of resentment or irritation throughout the rest of the campaign, I had built up enough trust that they knew this was but one encounter in a series and they could get retribution in the future. And that one event has been transformative to how my players engage at the table. They actually are now way more engaged, they pay real close attention to lore drops. Everything I usually see that DMs are like, how can I get my players to do this? They started engaging with in a really thoughtful way. But the respect and empathy came first. One of my players even said, "I was really scared about losing my character at the time, and I trusted you as the dungeon master." It's a great example how a specific narrative maneuver can either land flat or soar. I could have played the exact same scenario with a different group and had a completely opposite, negative, toxic scenario. But because I was clear and upfront before the start of this campaign, what my table culture was going to look like, the boundaries and rules that we were all going to play by, and not only did I respect those things, but I made sure to listen and adjust for the emotional core of my players, well, we ended up with a really awesome campaign so far. So, in conclusion, if you're looking to be part of a great game, I recommend practicing in this progression: respect, empathy, satisfaction, and trust. Now, while I imagine a lot of you listening may be thinking, this sounds like the game master's job, you're absolutely right. The game master or dungeon master has disproportionate authority over the narrative of the game being run. That also means that they are disproportionately more responsible for practicing these things to cultivate a positive table culture. However, players listening, this does not abdicate you from responsibility. Respect your dungeon master, empathize with them. If they've put their heart and soul in a custom world, even if you have the sense they did so selfishly, play in it as sincerely as possible. Trust, after all, is a two-way street. From what I've seen, if you are a respectful and empathetic player that does their best to play sincerely, even from the player side of the screen, you're helping cultivate a positive table culture, even if it's not as proportionate to how the game master rules things. Now, I know that sounds overly optimistic. Just remember where we started from: respect. Sometimes the most respectful thing to do for a table is to bow out. Even in my latest game, which is the most enjoyable, deep, satisfying game I've run, I've had a few players bow out before, but they did so in a respectful way and it helped preserve the relationship. And after all, isn't that what this is all about? Now I want to know your thoughts. Do you have any personal anecdotes with respect, empathy, satisfaction, or trust? Let us know in the comments down below. If you like this video, let YouTube know. Hit like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.